So welcome everybody to actually what is the final edition of IBEI's research seminars. I really appreciate you all coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Roger. I'm an assistant professor at IBEI, and I'm with Leslie Ann Daniels, one of the hosts of the seminar series. And it's my pleasure to introduce Teresa Kramarz, who is an associate professor of global affairs, director of the Monk One Foundation program at the Monk School of Global Affairs. And in addition to all of those titles, she's also the co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab. She's an expert on environmental issues, international organizations, and accountability issues surrounding them. And today she's going to be speaking to us about her new book, Forgotten Values, the World Bank and Environmental Partnerships, which is going to be out later this year with MIT Press. So Teresa, we're super happy to have you here. And in addition, we also have Oscar Wiederberg as our discussant. He's from the Free University of Amsterdam, and he's an expert on transnational governance, environmental politics, and I couldn't actually think of a more ideal discussant for this work. So we're happy to have you here as well. And of course, all of our listeners. So before we begin, just a few notes. So as Teresa mentioned, she'll speak for about 35 minutes or so. And while she's doing so, everybody is temporarily muted to ensure that there's sort of no minimal disruption. So I ask you to hold all of your questions to the very end. And then, as we said, Oscar will share his comments. We'll give Teresa a chance to respond. And then once she's done, then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So I think that that's it from me at the moment. So I will come back again to moderate once Teresa's done. But for now, thank you everyone, and thank you, Teresa, whenever you're ready.
So thanks very much to Charlie for having me here, and to Oscar to offer some comments, and for all of you for joining me in this conversation. And I want to emphasize that I hope it really is a conversation. So I'll give you a part of this book, which comes out of actually some of my own experience working in the World Bank. So as Charlie said, this will be coming out, I think, at the end of July, and it's published by MIT Press. And so let me tell you a little bit about how I come to this research first. Before rejoining the Academy, I for about 10 years with first United Nations Development Program and then the World Bank. And I got to experience different organizational cultures shape interventions on the ground. So shape the kind of, I worked on always sustainable development projects, but it really mattered how the organization was, the culture of the organization on these on the way in which projects were implemented. I also experienced, and I don't think this is a unique experience, persistent development failures. So around the mid-1990s, there was this growth in a new form of governance. So whereas before there was the traditional multilateral approach of an international organization like the World Bank implementing projects with mandates from states and financing from states, this new form of governance was called partnerships, later took on different names, multi-stakeholder initiatives, which I write about extensively with Philip Hatt. Well, and it offered a window into a new potential, into new possibilities of interactions between global and local agendas, between public and private actors, with different views, preferences, initiatives, ways of doing things. It also gave authority to new actors in sustainable development. So I was very interested in how this what would be the result of these new forms of governance, hybrid governance arrangements. So as I said, from the mid-1990s, we start to see this groundswell of partnerships, and they continue to be across different issue areas in the environment, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how they play out in the World Bank specifically, but environment being one of the very large areas in which these partnerships grow. There's a big normative bias in favor of working in partnerships. So as opposed to being a means to an end, partnerships are almost framed as an end unto themselves. And you can see from Millennium Development Goals, goal 8 is to have a global partnership. That's carried on to Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 17 is, akin to eradicating poverty, is having a partnership for these goals. So the means distinction starts to get a little bit blurred there, and in development projects, it's you have to continuously justify. It doesn't matter whether you're in the World Bank or USAID or UNDP. How are you working in partnerships? Who are your partners? The whole idea of going at it alone is just not an option. In international organizations, in particular, are leading in this rise of the partnership phenomenon. So Liliana Andonova, for example, calls them partnership entrepreneurs, international organizations. Philip Batberg has extensive work on documenting how states and international organizations are the initiators, the leaders, the main nodes of partnerships. And Ken Abbott and others have worked on a research program called Orchestration, where partnerships are international organizations are actually seen as ideal nodes of these multiple actors that are rising in global governance. And the potential is also these partnerships will have a good effect on the international organization and reduce pathologies by bringing in, as I said, new ways of doing business and new ways of implementing and new ideas into the mix. So lots of potential there. So basically, what leads the study are two research questions. The first is, what do these? So there's a bit of what I found. There are critics for sure on partnerships, but a rational exuberance throughout the 1990s and onwards around partnering. So what do these World Bank partnerships with non-state actors actually achieve? And maybe I'll give you a punchline. Not very much here, because my second question is that I want to understand, right? Why do these partnerships actually fall short on their promise? So the way the book is organized actually is by looking at a big, let me see if that's the next slide since I can't see it. So a big swath of partnerships over a 20-year period between 1992 and 2012, and say, okay, well, what are the big patterns here that tell me what are these partnerships actually achieving on the ground? And then I present a theoretical chapter on how do we understand this disparity, right, between what they were supposed to do and what they're actually achieving. And so I test, if you will, that theoretical explanation on two specific cases. And these cases are the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund and the Global Invasive Species Program. The first is a huge partnership with the World Bank and Conservation International, France, and others. And the purpose is really to work with civil society throughout critical ecosystems, where there are endemic ecosystems to biodiversity. And the second one is actually a much smaller partnership that is no longer functioning. That's interesting because it was a partnership that existed before the World Bank joined it. So there's a nice comparison of what was the partnership like when the bank wasn't there, what was the partnership when the bank joined. And it worked on creating programming to avoid the spread of invasive species. So I rely on, I'll just say this very quickly, but I rely on archival research at the World Bank. I go back to 1999, where the concept of partnering first emerges in the World Bank. I do several interviews of core participant observation in the field and in secretariats and partnership secretariats and meetings, and then of course extensive internal documents, examinations, right? So, okay, let me just make sure I'm not skipping stuff. I can't see the next slide, so I'm just guessing. So first things first, we have to actually qualify what we mean when we talk about partnerships, because as I said, since there is this exuberance around partnering, things are partnerships. So one-time meetings are partnerships. The concept of partnering is used kind of fast and loose. So it's important to really encapsulate in all research around partnerships to say what do we really mean when we're talking about partnerships for conceptual clarity. So I use this definition and then impose 5 strict conditions for initiatives that call themselves partnerships to actually be partnerships as part of the study. So the definition is that they're formal co-governance arrangements between public and private actors who implement conservation interventions on the ground. Now, the 5 conditions align quite well with what the World Bank has decided must be the conditions of their partnership practice or business line, if you will. The first is these are global initiatives, so they must be financing activities across countries. That's easy. The second is they have to be financing activities on the ground, so they have to be operational. So what would not be operational is, I don't know, conferences and meetings and exchanges of information without actual financing of biodiversity conservation activities, dealing with biodiversity that's on the ground. A third is that it has to focus on biodiversity, and I rely on whether the bank has categorized in order to decide whether an initiative is in or out of the study. The bank has categorized it as being a biodiversity initiative. The fourth is that it has to be governed by public and private actors. So the might be the World Bank, other international organizations, state agencies, but also subnational actors, so cities or networks of cities. And the private excuse me, and the private actors are they can be non-governmental organizations, they can be for-profit firms, they can be foundations, unions, academic organizations. So it's these 2 groups coming together as co-governors. Excuse me, my throat is really dry. As co-governors. And the 5th condition is that they have to actually have set up a separate governance institution that that decides on the direction, the approach of the partnership. And this is important because what's different from really traditional multilateral projects is that these are supposed to be their own nodes of decision making, as opposed to having the World Bank. Otherwise, it looks like a traditional project, right? The World Bank sets up a project coordination unit, and it tells it what to do and how, and then controls if it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. So the ability to have a separate arrangement, a separate institution that's governing the activities of the partnership is a really important condition that makes them unique, and it allows us to see what choices they make and why. So some examples that go into like the broader studies of this over this 20-year period might be the World Wildlife Fund joins with the World Bank in order to do forest conservation and sustainable use. And some of its outputs are, creating 500 million acres of forest under independent certification, creating 50 million acres of new forested protected areas. Another one that is current, that is functioning, is the Biodiversity and Agricultural Commodities Program, and this is an industry organization that partners with the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility. In particular, it's the arm of the World Bank here that's partnering with this initiative is the International Financial Corporation. And they are looking to protect biodiversity across the subchain in the production of agricultural commodities. So these are just some examples for you to grab onto something less abstract for the time being. So back to my story. So we see the growth in partnerships in the World Bank, again, from the Pearson Commission report in 1969, where partnering becomes part of the lexicon, although reference there is to the partnership between clients, between recipients, donors, and recipient states, right? So the partnering meaning we share in the risk and responsibility of making development work and development outcomes as planned. In 1972, the first totally related partnership is launched in the World Bank. And then, as I said, throughout the presidency of James Wolfenson in the mid-90s, you have this steady growth of partnerships. There's a big uptick of environmental partnerships under Robert Zoellick. And then by 2012, when it's the closing parentheses on this study, there are about 145 partnerships in the bank that are dispersing around $7 billion annually. And as I said at the beginning, most partnerships in the bank are in these three sectors: environment, and health, and the agricultural sectors. So as you can see here, the bank has enormous influence in these partnerships. It's not just another partner. It is a founder, a co-founder most of the time. It's a convener. It's contributing its own financial resources. It is a member of the governing board, and often it chairs that board and hosts the secretariat. So it has multiple channels of influence to ensure that they live up to what they are supposed to produce. So what is that? What is that partnership promise? What is the main justification for setting up partnerships? So three leading arguments advanced by the bank and also academics that support partnerships. First is, why do we want partnerships? And again, this is they're in international relations. They're functionalist and normative explanations. But I'm focusing on what are the justifications that the World Bank offers to be able to set a gauge on if we want to see how do they perform, we have to figure out how to perform vis-a-vis what. So these are the bank's own standards. So first, the purpose of partnering is they democratize decision making. So they bring new actors. They allow for tabling of multiple ideas and contesting different conceptions of biodiversity and how to address it. So they open up the governance opportunities to multiple actors. Second is they promote innovation through private sector participation. And a lot of this is imbued with the new public management literature that the supposed benefits of having private sector participate in public sector activities is going to bring with it efficiencies that are really, the private sector practices, but also having non-state actors, even when they're not for-profit firms, is going to allow new ideas to be tabled, so new approaches to conservation policy in this case. And third is that they will catalyze additional financial resources. So the kind of the taglines go like, there's the problems, these global issues have become so complex, no one actor can go at it alone, and no one actor can actually finance what's required in order to address these global problems. And those are kind of justifications that are offered not just for biodiversity, but in general for partnerships. So I went too far. So let's look at, as I look at some of the achievements against those standards. I look at some of these multiple partnerships that I look at during this 20-year period. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just wanted to give you a sense. How do we know that they're actually delivering on these promises of democratization, innovation, and additional financial resources? I look at some measures that are closely linked to minimization of natural resource in the literature, and assess what kinds of impact on inclusiveness, representation, and empowerment bank partnerships are having. For innovation, I look at, in biodiversity conservation, what is the most the most dominant policy approach to biodiversity conservation, which is command and control conservation. So essentially creating protected areas and keeping sort of people out and wildlife in. And this is an approach to biodiversity conservation that hasn't been, it is actually the North American, the United States experience with its national park system. And it's not a recipe that has worked very well in developing countries where poverty and sustaining rural livelihoods is so intrinsically connected to natural resource use. So oftentimes building fences around parks does not keep poor people from trying to access parks, because their livelihoods are connected to these parks. So oftentimes these parks are called parks on paper. So some alternatives have been commodification. So the market becomes an authority here in that the kinds of projects that come out of this are, for example, payment for ecosystem services, so bioprospecting, ecotourism, but ways to commodify nature in order to save it is another tagline. So there's another contender, which is community conservation. Community conservation, the kinds of activities that are done under this approach would include things like cadastre registries and land tenure reform and collaborative management of natural resources with communities. Again, just to show you that there's competition around this dominant policy, and we can actually analyze the project mix of these different partnerships to see how much of what they do actually resembles what was already being done versus what innovative new policies could be pursued. And then I look at, of course, the financial significance of the partnership and what is the co-financing, how much is the bank putting for the partners. Okay, so to summarize, the findings are as I told you they would be from the beginning, but the partnerships are actually becoming democratic, but only at the top, only within the secretariats. So excuse me. So they are. Let me just flip to something that I wanted to tell you. Across the board in biodiversity conservation, before I tell you about how they're becoming democratic in some ways and not others, the kinds of players being brought into, so the partners that the World Bank is actually reaching out to and creating these partnerships with are NGOs, first and foremost. Not so the concern with for example, the privatization of government, that for-profit firms were going to take over governance of conservation through partnerships is not really materializing in the World Bank. NGOs are the key players in biodiversity governance. They have gained significant influence over biodiversity governance because they have become leading, meaning they are managers of the partnership. So they host the partnership secretariat, or they are the organization that's in charge of implementation of partnership activities. So the thing to note here is that it's not just any NGO. They are large international conservation NGOs. So think of Conservation International, Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy. They have gained enormous decision-making authority in this governance arena. Second, these organizations are based mostly in the United States and Europe, and they focus mostly in global biodiversity. So as opposed to looking at the local environment and rural livelihoods nexus. And as I said, the partnership boards, so the governance structure is authoritative, but it is a shareholder model of governance rather than stakeholders. So if you put money into the partnership, you get to make decisions about how the partnership is going to work. If you don't, but you're affected by the partnership projects, you are by and large not part of the decision-making process. So they democratized decision-making at the very top and among actors who had all significant amount of power. And this is confirmed by earlier research as well in different data sets. So the problem is that these partnerships are not only mirroring a problem in global governance, but perpetuating it, which is an underrepresentation of local interests, an undemocratic process of arriving at biodiversity conservation decisions. I'll go through the rest a little more quickly just because I'm short for time, but in terms of I conduct a mapping exercise on what kinds of policies these partnerships are pursuing, and they are converging around the most dominant approaches, which is command and control, where the state is the main authority and not the community, and in some cases commodification, where the market is the main authority. So innovation is not apparent among partnerships. They are applying the same kind of state-led policies that emerged during the early years of innovation in the United States and have not proven very effective in developing countries where all the world's biodiversity, most of the world's biodiversity is concentrated. They have also not catalyzed additional financial sources as expected. Sorry if I'm rushing a little bit. So how do I make sense of this gap between promise and performance? Well, a dominant explanation is relying on the principal agent account. Principal agent theory tells us, well, don't be surprised. We'll be expecting a gap between what agents are told to do by principals and what they actually do, because they have slack. Agents have the chance to use their information and asymmetries in their preferences. So just to use the example of the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, Conservation International has its own sets of institutional preferences, and when the World Bank, the leading and influential partner in that partnership, and the other partners agree on Conservation International being the managing partner, that organization becomes an agent. So these PA accounts tell us, yeah, there will be a gap between what the principal wants and the agent does, and it's a conundrum because the authority that the principal actually has to delegate to the agents is being used against the principal. So what's the solution in these cases? To devise controls. So create contracts that have controls over agents, that that they must deliver how and why and when according to the principal's preferences. They're much more sophisticated accounts of principal agent. Gutner and Sobel, for example, talk about antinomic delegation and pathological delegation, where the problem is not just the agent, the principal, where, for example, I think it's Sobel who talks about Security Council settings where there are multiple principles with conflicting demands that really create a structural environment where it is almost impossible for agents to deliver to the preferences of these conflicting and multiple principles. So when we apply the PA account to the World Bank, we do actually see extended chains of delegation. So there isn't just one principal and one agent. There are multiple principals and multiple agents. So we see delegation from member states to the bank, from the bank to partnerships, from partnerships to managing partner, and then the managing partner, Conservation International, was sitting in Arlington, Virginia, where the biodiversity is not. So it also delegates to national organizations in Peru and China, et cetera, to implement activities on the ground. So if we take the PA account seriously, we should expect to see all sorts of gaps in the preferences and actions here. this gives us a narrow view of what's happening, because it doesn't tell us why does the bank create hierarchical delegation relationships in the first place. If this is supposed to be, if partnerships are supposed to be a relationship of equals based on trust and reciprocity, why are we seeing hierarchy? Why are we seeing delegation? Moreover, why are we seeing delegation among a select group of partners? Why are we not seeing delegation to a small community organization in the Amazon, but only to these large conservation organizations? We also can't tell from the PA account in what direction will the agents actually slip. So they opt to work with some organizations on the ground versus others. And why will they make those choices? Will they choose to use the protected area recipe over the co-management recipe with local communities? And why? The PA account doesn't tell us much about what direction these agents, if they're going to use their Slack, in which direction they're going to use it. It also policy implications. The PA account doesn't tell us very much, tells us, sorry, that in order to, as I said before, in order to avoid the slip, we want to create tighter controls on the agent. So again, a partnership, which is supposed to be one, an ideal in its highest form, a horizontal relationship, becomes characterized by adversity. It's on the agent, and the principal is just trying to exert controls to ensure that the agent's not taking advantage of it. And so it begs the question whether the bank should be devising controls, in fact, for its partnerships, which I assume the answer is no, if it is actually a partnership among equals. So I argue that we need to subsume this rationalist account of principal agent into an organizational account of what is the World Bank. We need to look beyond the nature of this contract between the World Bank and its partners and say, okay, but let's look at what is the organizational context in which this is happening. And when we look at the World Bank as an organization, it's primarily a bureaucracy. So, Fabers Theory of bureaucracies tells us that we need to investigate how this bureaucratic character influences the sorts of goals that we are interested in analyzing. So in this case, the dependent variables, if you will, of this study are democracy, innovation, and finance. So how does being a bureaucracy affect partnerships' ability to deliver these promises of democracy, innovation, and greater financing? I don't want to go through. I don't want to go through all these characteristics of bureaucratic organizations, but if we take, for example, the World Bank as a risk-averse institution, we start to understand those questions that were left over from the application of a principal agent account, right? So why does it rely on delegation rather than governance, and to whom it prefers to delegate? Well, the bank is a large bureaucracy. Operational concerns over ease of disbursement and execution and monitoring. And this kind of deepens our understanding why it chooses the partners it does and scrutinizes operational effectiveness above everything else. So the community organization, the hypothetical community organization that I mentioned in the Amazon, doesn't have the AAA Oracle financials that Conservation International has in Arlington, Virginia. That means they require, if they were to be managing partners in a partnership, it would require a lot more many more monitoring hours, and a certain amount, well, a significant amount of risk potentially. That reporting won't be done right, the policies and procedures won't be followed to the T. They have not been trained in policies and procedures in the same way as Conservation International and other large conservation organizations that have been working with the bank on many different projects for a long time, have an installed capacity to be able to deliver the kind of reporting requirements that the bank requires, and as accountability also to its own principles. So so this sets up the partnerships that were meant to be horizontal as hierarchies and delegations. And the bank seeks to ensure that partnerships actually follow these institutional reporting procedures to mitigate concerns that it has about its own reputation. So oftentimes in partnership conversations in the World Bank and speeches and in documents, you see a lot of concern over reputational risks that are part of entering into a partnership, because there's a loss of exclusive agency over projects when you are in a partnership. So there's a need to actually trust your partner. But if you are risk averse, you have a very hard time trusting, and you trust only a select group of actors. So this requirement limits democracy. So when you're a risk averse organization, it limits democracy innovation because it allows for the inclusion of a smaller pool of agents. And because individual actors carry ideas, also a more limited number of policy options are tabled. This is, again, just an example without going through the various other components of bureaucratic forms of organization, how they impact partnership formation and performance. So Weber pointed us to a very useful analytical distinction between goal rationality and value rationality. And goal, just to define it a little bit, goal rationality involves instrumental calculations. So it weighs what's the most efficient means to achieve the desired ends. So it's an economic faction. It's a utilitarian technical reasoning. Value rationality refers to intrinsic values that orient social action, right? So democratization and innovation, these are actual values that are guiding social action. And Weber's contribution is that bureaucracy and the project of humanity has moved this logic of social action towards goal rational and expedient behavior and away from value rational behavior. So the bureaucratic form of organization will emphasize economically efficient achievement of ends over means. So we see that partnership outputs, for example, how many hectares of protected forests were you able to declare, are privileged over partnership outcomes, which are means. Who had influence in that decision? Who framed the biodiversity problem as such? Whose interests were considered? These are the values that, as the book suggests, have been forgotten. So the bank creates these, in creating these bureaucracies, in creating these partnerships, it creates sort of offshoots of itself. It entrusts management of partnerships to select partners because they can deliver on these operational efficiencies. And values suffer. So democratization and policy innovations succumb to this goal rationality. So to close, what are the main things here and contributions to the literature? Well, as I've been arguing throughout this conversation, or not yet a conversation, presentation, partnerships are failing to deliver promise, and principally because they are set up and executed shadow of a large mature bureaucracy, that's the World Bank. So partnerships themselves become organized like the bank in order to respond to bank needs, and they become hierarchies. And in the global invasive species it's an excellent case that, as I said, shows you how this partnership, this network, loose confederation between scientists became a totally different organization with hierarchy and delegations, arrangements, and functional specializations of labor after the World Bank entered that partnership. So bureaucratic rationality tells us why partnerships will perform well on procedural metrics, but poorly on substantive metrics, because that is what's being central importance. So why does this matter? Well, first because this provides a very different view of conventional characterizations of partnerships. Again, as usually seen as horizontal organic governance arrangements based on trust and reciprocity. In the case of the World Bank, in biodiversity conservation, this is an incorrect characterization. This study also tries to shed some light on why international organization partnerships are functioning the way they are, and provide some leverage, which I do in my conclusion, actually, on how they might be improved. So we see that there's this misalignment between means and ends. And it begs the question of whether international bureaucracies like the bank are the best actors to pursue partnerships. What kind of baggage do they bring with them when they become orchestrators, when they become nodes or entrepreneurs of partnership arrangements? And finally, in thinking about this orchestration literature a little more, I have to question the kind of authority that managing partners have gained and has flown sort of under the radar. So Conservation International, in one of my case studies, has gained an enormous amount of influence and authority over conservation choices. What is the accountability mechanism that allows us to hold Conservation International responsive to different framings of what counts as biodiversity conservation, and to whom are they accountable? So this autonomy and discretionary authority should make us wonder who is in charge of biodiversity conservation. So we've known little about what kinds of partners international organizations make. So although we know that they are leaders and partnership entrepreneurs, we've not known a lot about what they're like as partners, how they function as partners in these steps, who they choose to partner with and why, and how does this affect the partnerships that they lead. So I hope that this research, that this study contributes to shed some light on some of these questions, which is undoubtedly just a beginning. And I thank you very much for your patience. I've gone over time. I look forward to your questions.
You're right on time. Don't worry about it. So now, so thank you so much for that, Teresa. It's just fantastic. And now we have some time for comments from Oscar. So Oscar, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So first, really thanks a lot to Teresa and Charlie for inviting me to give some comments and to start up this discussion. I wish, of course, we would have all met in Barcelona in person, but maybe next time. And also, just Teresa, congratulations. I mean, for this really amazing almost end of a journey, I can imagine, of writing a book. And also very excited to see that it's almost out. When is it expected to be out exactly? Do you know?
MIT said I think end of July it'll ship from the warehouses. So.
Okay, exciting. So then you will have a Twitter picture with you on the hard.
One of those virtual book launches that everybody's doing, right?
Fantastic, and you will have your hard copy at least for yourself. Well,
yeah.
Fantastic. I also just thanks for the presentation. I think you really embody or is able to embed this really long practical experience with, let's say, the frameworks and the thoughts and the ideas and the theories that we have in global environmental governance, in IR and sociology and political science in general. And it's very, I think, quite unique position you have, right? You've been able to claw yourself back into academia after being out of it for a while. And I think that's just an astounding experience, which also, I think, really is reflected in your book, right? It produces this exciting and very convincing study where, in a sense, it feels like you start from your practitioner's experience and your personal insights, and really then try to find the correct frameworks for thinking about that. Except for, from a theoretician's perspective, you start with the theories, right? And then you try to find somewhere to apply that. So I think that's just that's such a refreshing look. And personally, of course, I find these partnerships super fascinating. And why? I think because despite that we have very few studies that show how partnerships are a great tool for international or transnational governance to steer the society towards more sustainable goals. I mean, we don't have to look far for kind of quite somber insights in terms of environment, climate change, health, to find that there are a few partnerships that are doing very well, but most of them have very little substantive outputs. And that just keeps, you know, the question, why are they still so popular, right? Why have they been so popular over the last 20 years, and why do they even have their own SDG, and why do donor countries and IOs keep on thinking that they are so good? And I think, you know, I mean, we have you present some alternative answers to that in your book, and I think, you know, are they just embodiments of neoliberal environmentalism and opportunities for greenwashing, or are they really filling, let's say, a governance gap? So I think just that question keeps on being really relevant. But I think your contribution, what I really like with it, is that it's adding to the micro foundations, let's say the micro explanations of how partnerships work. So, and I think you build it very well, let's say, on Weber's the traditional principal agent and ideas around bureaucracy, and especially since you move into organizational culture. So one of the first one of the first papers I wrote was on bureaucracies, and I used at the time Biermann and Siebenhühner's book on the managers of global environmental change, I think it was called, right? They had a very neat framework, and they talked a little bit about organizational culture as an independent variable for describing why some organizations are able to be more autonomous than others. But their conclusions were quite like, well, you know, it's hard to know how to measure organizational culture. And then you do that. That's exactly, let's say, what you're able to show, right? And I think that's such a strong, you know, addition to the literature and to our knowledge about why it works. And especially this idea when you talk about risk-averse organizations, you know, that they, let's say, pursue instead of, you know, internal goals or navel gazing, instead of pursuing, let's say, the partnership objectives. So, and also to see how the organizational culture hampers innovation and effectiveness, which I think are the very, you know, raison d'être for partnerships in the first place, right? But to get to some of it, I mean, I have loads of questions, right? Of course, so loads of thoughts and ideas, and more came up now during the presentation. But maybe the first one is, and that's harking back to Siebenhühner and Biermann's book, is that isn't the World Bank a very special IO, right? They are the ones who have the money and the expertise. They can kind of bully others around and tell them what to do, and they can choose which NGOs to work with. And then I was wondering, you know, does your insights translate to something like UNESCO or you know, UNCTAD or other IOs which are much less, let's say, powerful, if you want to put it like that? In the Biermann and Siebenhühner book, they were considered very autonomous compared to the rest, but they were saying, well, look, it's just because they have so much money. That was a little bit the argument there. So, you know, maybe my first, I would be curious to hear what you think about that. Is the World Bank a special case, or do you think that your insights also are transferable to other IOs? Maybe start with that one.
Charlie, how do you want to do this? Do you want me to answer and then we
Sure.
go back and forth? Yeah?
Yeah, you can do that if you like. That's totally fine.
Thanks very much, Oscar. Yes, I think that you're absolutely right. The World Bank is a special IO in that it is very strong, in that it can set up lots of rules around the partnership game, if you will. It has, and as I showed you one of these slides, it has actually very, very definitive structural authorities in what kinds of within partnership arrangements. So does this travel to other international organizations? I don't want to make that claim because I think international organizations vary too much. They're they're very different. What gets called an international organization is not transferable also. So, I wouldn't want to make the case that this is that this study tells us that international organizations are not ever going to be good partnership entrepreneurs or partnership leads, or what I do want to argue, however, is that when international organizations are large bureaucracies, there should be a flag in the partnership formation, because there is something very strong about the logic of social action that comes with the as baggage of being a bureaucratic form of organization that infects. I don't know if I want to talk like this in a pandemic. The formation of the new organization. So this is there's a very self-conscious effort among, for example, in the private sector. So if you look at business management literature, big organizations are also in the private sector bureaucracies. So like IBM or Xerox, these were really large bureaucracies themselves, but they were much more self-conscious about their impact on the ability to create spaces for research and innovation. So what they did is to establish these very far away these very far away facilities for research and innovation that would be protected from the kind of bureaucratic logic that they would ultimately inflict, if you will, on those facilities. So they create Xerox PARC, or in California, and protect these. And in that sense, I think that partnerships should also be protected when large bureaucracies are in the mix, so that it doesn't. So as opposed, I guess my answer to your question is, it is not a study to say all international organizations are going to behave this way. All bureaucracies run this risk of having this impact on partnerships, and so if partnership, and if is the first question, if partnership is the appropriate governance tool to address a complex global issue, then it matters a lot who are the partners and what is the space that partners have to actually govern by according to their to the priorities and to the framing of the problem that they themselves set up, as opposed to receive like overwhelming influence from one of the partners when they come with so much baggage.
Okay, so in a way, what you're saying is that the partnership, because I was wondering, is there some way to suppress these, let's say, these processes or the behavior of the World Bank, right? Is there, if you in a partnership add another strong financier or someone who's able to, let's say, not allow them to bully the partnership into a certain, let's say, hierarchical situation, are there good examples of when it actually works, right? Because you went through quite a lot of partnerships, right? I mean, are there good examples when the partnerships with World Bank actually doesn't need to have a red flag when the organization and the goals are working as they should?
I don't know that I want to paint the World Bank as a bully, but when the World Bank hands over decision-making, authorities and authority, right? Like the Marty Finnemore quote, Michael Barnett. So when it hands over that authority, that implementation authority, to a managing partner, that managing partner, in fact, becomes the bully, right? So it's much more structural than it is based on the World Bank as an agent. And in fact, in my case studies, I look at how individuals within the organization try very hard to counter these bureaucratic influences, and they're big champions for small organizations that are trying to do, for example, the Global Invasive Species Program was very innovative for its time because it put invasive alien species on the global biodiversity agenda, which was not there before, and it was really trying to push through norms and policies across countries so that this problem of invasive alien species would be somewhat more controlled. But it is. I don't have a good example in biodiversity where where the bank creates enough distance not to suffocate the partnership.
Okay.
Because what it normally does is hand over its authority to another trusted partner, and that partner then suffocates the smaller stakeholders on the ground. And that what I mean by suffocate is, and I'm being a little bit, bombastic, but what I mean by that is there isn't a room, the kind of room that you need for participatory decision, for understanding what is the local reality here on the ground and what matters in terms of biodiversity conservation versus what we do as a recipe for all ecosystems around the world. So that's how I would couch it.
But so one thing, if I may, I mean, one thing that strikes me is that the way that you start is to saying, look, the presentation is all saying, look, there's more and more partnerships. There's hundreds of them now. We know that they don't seem to really deliver on their promises according to the academic literature. And then again, the organization, when it evaluates itself, or you said does pretty well on its goal rationality, but not value rationality, right? But maybe can you talk a little bit about how the World Bank evaluates its own partnership? How does it look at, let's say, its role in partnerships, and are they equally pessimistic about their efficacy and their innovativeness? And if so, how do you motivate pursuing them or continuing them and continuing to proliferating in partnerships if they don't seem to, according to us, always even follow the goal rationality? How does that work, let's say, with this insider view in terms of evaluation?
Well, the independent evaluation group within the World Bank has been quite often critical of partnership results. So the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund is actually seen as like a best case study. This is like a champion of how partnerships ought to be done, because they involve civil society around the world in implementing biodiversity projects, in doing taxonomies and training park rangers and different activities on the ground, right? The Global Invasive Species Program is seen as a worst case in partnership experience within the World Bank. This is how the bank self-evaluates these partnerships. But the reasons why the first is seen as a success is because it actually disperses. It actually produces the kinds of metrics of evaluation that are translatable to donors. And this is what I tried to talk about, like X hundred million hectares of forests and protected areas. And so what is their sustainability 10 years from now? Are they just parks on paper? Not getting picked up. Who was actually allowed? So when you go to the field, you don't say to a community, what does your community look like to you? What are the points of tension? What are the problems that you identify? What are the issues or ways in which you would like to see this change? How does this connect to your housing, to your landscape approaches, right? So to housing and to your productive activities and to your that's not how the World Bank and nor its partners actually approach field projects, right? There are certain in the ecosystem hotspots, for example, they have specific profiles. So these are the hotspots determined in Arlington. These are the priorities. And now we're going to go to the community and talk to them about how to implement some of the activities that are going to allow for these priorities to be developed. So that's serving up 80% of the issue already. So there's actually an opportunity cost for the community, because now they have to, on top of their own survival needs, they have to take on the job of implementing projects, right? So oftentimes they implement them for a time, and as soon as the partnership is gone, that project falls apart. So you have these consistent development failures, right? Because there's no sustainability when the community itself has not seen this as a priority or a or something that they that connects to the rest of their lives in meaningful ways. So the World Bank is critical of, and the evaluation group in particular is critical, but it is those critiques are really muted when partnership is really able to deliver, so much money across so many different countries and so many different ecosystems, because these are very legible metrics to donors.
That's fascinating. I think I mean, if I may have a final also, I'm looking in virtually at Charlie here. A final comment or a question that I have, and that is a little bit here. So you mentioned the big NGOs, Conservation International and the World Bank, but where are the states here, right? So I was thinking about your chain of delegation on slide 20. You have the member states that are, the principles of the World Bank in terms of, in general, and then you have the World Bank, who is the principle of the partnership. But of course, you would also have states joining the partnerships.
That's right.
So you would have partnerships in the states. So you have almost like a feedback loop in the delegation chain of delegation. But maybe you can talk a little bit about, where do the states come into picture here? Who's pushing the partnership agenda? Is someone, starting to criticize it? Because I can't imagine that all countries or states are equally happy with this, what you're talking about as a goal values instead of or goal rationality instead of value rationality for them to join.
So it got a little bit cut up there, Oscar. So where you ask where member states come in, that is not just as principals at the front of the chain, but also as partners.
Exactly. So almost the double role of donor countries, right, of states, as both being the general principles of the World Bank, but also very much part of some hands-on in some in some partnerships, right? So how do you see their role in partnerships, and why would they pursue them if they also, because I can imagine some states are not too happy with this goal rationality and would like to have them more, participatory and adhere to more of these normative values that you bring up very much in your book as well.
I don't know what is the commitment to states to have community-driven, democratic decision-making, representative and empowering decision-making as partners. The way that they actually function in practice is they delegate their own authority to the bank in following, okay, we're going to go, so the operational manuals of partnerships are World Bank operational manuals and safeguards. So the partner, the world, there's a lot of deference from states as partners to World Bank rules and procedures. So it's not that it doesn't have any opinions, or that it does. So different states like France or Japan or whatever, but they mostly bring in money. Part of when they form part of partnerships, they are part of the whatever the executive body or the steering committee or whatever of the partnership, but they delegate an awful lot of authority and to the World Bank. And what the bank does is that implementation authority to a managing partner, to a major organization. Now that's a really excellent question, because it is an opportunity for states to actually and I have to think a lot more critically about this. Thank you, because it is an excellent opportunity for states to actually push from within as opposed to from the top. If you take this PA account seriously and you expect there to be a lot of slack, then you probably want to push from the top for certain values. And then when you're in the partnership, when you're inside an organization to again push for a certain kind of exactly. So thank you for that.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Thanks a lot, Teresa. I think that's all of my. I mean, I have many more questions, but I think good now to open up the floor.
Exactly, wonderful. Yeah, I actually have multiple pages of notes from the discussion that you guys are having, so it's super interesting for me. But yes, so now everybody should be able to use their microphones, and we can have a more general discussion. There's a little man at the bottom with or a woman, I suppose, as well, with a raised hand, and so you just press that, and then you can put your hand up, and then we can call upon you, and you can join the discussion. So does anybody have any questions burning that they would like to ask? I mean, I have a whole bunch, but I'm happy to give other people the floor first. Montserrat. So to use the microphone, you just press the microphone button at the bottom, and you should be able to speak.
Oh, okay. There we go. I think.
Perfect.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Ah, okay. Okay. So I was wondering to what extent this applies to the Sustainable Development Goals, since the UN maybe has a different organizational culture, as you were saying at the beginning of your presentation, and so it did come up with this collection of goals within the framework of their 2030 agenda, and that I think has shifted the burden of responsibility. Well, as they have this goal for partnership formation, it kind of feels to me that they shift the burden of responsibility to these public-private partnerships for the implementation. And so to what extent should we be more concerned to keep the United Nations itself as an organization accountable for the design of such a plan than on how these partnerships are going to be kept accountable themselves?
Can you rephrase a little bit? So to what extent are I'm just having a little bit of like an unstable connection, so it cuts out a little some words. So to what extent should we expect the United Nations as an organization, as an umbrella organization, to create accountability?
No, so like to what extent, would it be interesting, let's put it that way, asking like how the United Nations as an organization should be held accountable for the design of an international agenda, goal-based agenda, that puts the burden of implementation in partnerships. So like kind of shifting the focus from the accountability to the partnerships to the accountability of the organization itself.
I worry. Can I answer, or do you want to take a few?
Yeah.
Is
sure.
that okay?
Yeah, no, please, why don't you answer it right away, and then we can...
All right. I worry about these one-size-fit-all kind of approaches, because partnerships are really unique, and they're supposed to be unique and nimble and small and responsive, and otherwise you have multilateralism, like with its big clunkiness, right, already. So if you're going to have this multiplicity of actors, and it might come incoherence and fragmentation, if you're going to have those costs, at least let's have these benefits of having small organizations that are able to come together and respond to complex global issues in ways that are quite unique. If you, on top of that, you put a layer of, okay, here is international, here's the United Nations, and again, tell me if I'm not understanding correctly, but if we say, okay, on top of that, that partnership, we're going to put a layer of accountability imposed by an international organization like the United Nations, and I imagine perhaps not the entire United Nations, but some specialized agencies or whatever. I feel like it just adds to the sort of top-down control that we're trying to avoid. So the idea is to make these, to free up these partnerships, to be less less caught up in the web. There's a book called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. It's a disgusting image, but it is a book. It's a business book about how to do business, do well without getting sucked into, you know, the bureaucracy of a large corporation. Right, so you want to try and I agree with a sentiment. I might call it something else, but you want to try and create or opportunities. Yes, accountability measures, but are not going to add to the top-down heaviness of these partnerships. And by the way, because I work on accountability, I do want to mention that it is very important to question to whom accountability relationships are functioning, right? So are partnerships accountable to the World Bank, to the United Nations, or are partnerships accountable to the supposed beneficiaries on the ground, right? To the biodiversity and livelihoods that are supposed to be affected by the activities of these partnerships.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, great. We also have a question that Ksenia wrote. I don't know whether you want to ask the question yourself or I can read it out as well, whichever you prefer. But she thanks you for the question or the presentation. And she was asking actually about whether other multilateral development banks, so I assume, you know, regional banks, etc., are subject to the same problem that you identify in the case of the World Bank, or are there new issues that arise when they come into play in partnerships? Either that I suppose that they can create their own and then maybe are subject just replicating the same issues, but there might also be issues where there's other development banks working with the World Bank within the context of a partnership. That could also raise issues too. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, this is kind of going back to Oscar's first question on how does this travel, right, how does this finding kind of travel to other organizations? I haven't, so in the partnerships that I look at, there aren't other multilateral development banks involved. There are United Nations agencies that do become involved in some of these partnerships that I study. Again, there's continual deference to the leading authority of the bank. That's not to say that in minutes of meeting and in executive decision making there isn't like a discussion and contestation that goes against the prioritization that the bank might have what to do in a certain partnership, but I haven't found a significant influence from other partners. That's a blanket statement. It depends. So it depends. Some issues, yes, and some issues not. So I have not done a comparative and systematic study between how the World Bank operates in partnerships as a partner and how, for example, other organizations like UNDP I'm very familiar with, how does UNDP function as an organization and as a partner? So I don't want to speak in a scholarly way about it because I have not done this kind of systematic study. I can just tell you anecdotally from working in both organizations that it is very different to work in UNDP where process has is given a lot more leeway, where it's not that it's not driven by results, and it's not that it doesn't have the same pressure from donors to deliver on results, but it is perhaps as a function of having it being so decentralized in some ways, right? So having so many field offices throughout the world that it allows for a lot more of local priority setting and local decision making. So perhaps the way that international organization is structured allows for different kinds of emphasis and processes. Is also not a bank. makes a big difference. So a bank acts and is imbued with a very different logic of action than a development agency that is like UNDP. Kind of answering your question, I think, in a roundabout way. Okay, thanks. Great.
Beautiful. So anybody else have other questions that they would like to ask? Well, if not, then I might use my power of the chair to ask one or two. So I was kind of curious about a couple of things. So in what sense are the two partnerships? So we talked a lot about generalizability. And I think that there's like this question, look, are other IOs going to affect partnerships in the way that the World Bank does? And I kind of agree, there might be sort of a bureaucratic, like when you're talking about massive bureaucracies, then that's sort of the scope condition, you're going to get the same thing. So I buy that. But then to what degree are the partnerships that we're looking at typical of the other World Bank partnerships that they have, like not necessarily in biodiversity, but then you have a whole bunch of biodiversity ones, but then you've looked at these ones. So then how can we sort of generalize to that set, and then to the set of other World Bank partnerships? Are there differences that you sort of see? And then the like wider question is like beyond to other organizations, and there are other ones that seem to be working better, I guess, although the comparison's sort of more difficult as you go further and further away from the World Bank, of course, right? But so, with those like sets of groups, how would you sort of see the results? I mean, the answer is going to be it depends to some degree, but sort of how far can we go? That's my first question. I'm happy to ask others.
Yeah. So I have focused on biodiversity, and I haven't looked at how they compare to, for example, health partnerships, which would be comparable. Like, for example, infrastructure partnerships, which are different beasts altogether. They're much more like these, subcontracting arrangements. They're not really what the World Bank calls partnerships. So there are differences in biodiversity. For example, the World Bank attracts mostly NGOs as partners. In other issue areas, other multilateral organizations are really primary partners. Foundations, Bill and Melinda Gates, have enormous influence within health partnerships with the World Bank. Because they themselves, as an organization, have a power of convening that rivals that of the World Bank around health issues. I don't have this is sort of like a pin on avenues for further research, because I have not conducted, again, a systemic comparison between how these biodiversity partnerships compare to other issue areas. But it is kind of a logical shoot of this research to see whether it holds, right? Whether the bank exerts, because you can control for some things. The bank is still the same organization, and how it reacts. How much does the international context and issue area specificity affect the behavior, and performance of a partnership when the same World Bank partner is in it?
Right. Yeah. Because when I was thinking about this, you have the threefold sort of way of thinking about democratization and resources and innovation. And the way that you're looking at innovation is these specific varieties of, community-based biodiversity, conservation policies, etc. And I just wonder, like, you could go to another issue area and its bias is completely different, right? And so its bias could be in favor of the more innovative. And so that's just coming down to this bureaucratic logic. So you might get some variation across issue areas as a result of these kinds of things. Yeah,
exactly. And I don't. So I would have to become much. Develop much better expertise around health policies to take the kind of put the stake in the ground the way I have with biodiversity, which I know so much more, around what has been the history of this command and control recipe, and why it's been so intractable. It's been so recalcitrant. Is that recalcitrant? No? Yeah. So yeah. Despite its widespread failures, right? So this is one of the things that actually brought me to this research. Is like, why does this, parks on paper continue to exist? Well, keep putting bad money after good money, or good money after bad money, when you have a lot of evidence that these parks actually are not, that the experience of North America with protected areas is not transferable. This in the same way that when you are dealing with poverty and livelihoods, you have to involve the community, if for no other reason than to make biodiversity conservation effective.
Yeah, which actually sort of leads to one of the other questions that I had, which was, I mean, it is really sort of puzzling that they continue with this practice that, despite sort of its evident failure. But what sort of reminded me of is actually the practice of public-private partnerships in that infrastructure sense, or in the service provision sense, right? That happens in sort of the domestic context. And I understand the terms are different, but in the way that they're being used. But it strikes me that a lot of the literature that's tried to evaluate all of these public-private partnerships that states create to provide certain services or whatever, cost savings for building, whatever infrastructure projects, that those have also been subject to these criticisms that they're not saving any money by doing this, and yet they actually persist in this with these public-private partnerships. So it's really sort of taken hold. And so I wonder whether you think that, it suggests to me that might be being driven by sort of, this sort of liberal, Stephen Bernstein-esque kind of dynamic that where there's all sorts of other, where it's sort of part of the zeitgeist to sort of produce these things over and over again, despite the fact that they're not really doing much work. Oscar, did you have something that's to say?
Can I just say, yeah. Sorry, Oscar. Yeah. I just wanted to say that one thing on infrastructure partnerships, there is this, you see in infrastructure partnerships the same tension of how much room to give to the public side, how much to give to the private side. And Oscar will be familiar with this from our book together on accountability, right? So the different logics of action here at work, right? So the public sector is really supposed to be working and be accountable to the public good, right? The private sector is really accountable to its shareholders for profit. So private sector, often infrastructure partnership, says you don't give us enough leeway to actually bring our innovative ideas and efficiencies and stuff. And the public sector is, well, we're afraid, right? We're afraid you're just going to take off and just cut corners and make profit, because that's where your accountability mechanisms lie, right? So there's this tension also in how much room do you give to managing partners when you delegate, even in infrastructure partnerships. But for example, in infrastructure partnerships was like, no, I don't know if there are any, I think that I was looking at this in the province of Ontario or in Canada, like no infrastructure partnership has ever won an architectural prize. Well, wasn't that what they were supposed to bring, right? Like this, like greatness. And they're like, yeah, but there's no room to maneuver, right? Like you put in so many controls around us in this delegation that you also don't give us any room to bring what we're supposed to bring. So, sorry, Oscar.
No, it was a bit of a follow-up question. I was hoping that you would first answer Charlie's question, then a follow-up question on this. And this is just, so it feels like we kind of reached these conclusions now over the last 20 years with the research, right? And I think that, as you said, Charlie, the environmental liberalism, or the neoliberal environmentalism idea, the idea that, let's say, we have innovative experimental partnerships that come up with new solutions that doesn't seem to deliver, seem to live in the literature but not much on the ground. And your work on accountability also, and adding other stuff that Karen has been doing, and and Michael Mason and everyone across through the years, is that we have this conflicting, let's say, or not conflicting, but these different types of logics. My question is what I'm very curious about now. What do you think? I mean, maybe it's also to both of you. What do you think are the next steps, let's say, in partnership research? I mean, you know, what are we the next 10 years? You know, what are the next steps that we should take? What should we look into? What are the concepts? Where can we make discoveries, and where can we make additions that will help both the academics but maybe also practitioners forward?
Well, I think you've mentioned a couple of things, like, you know, how do these findings travel between international organizations and across different issue areas. However, I'm particularly interested in the orchestration literature. The global environmental governance space is very overpopulated. So is the development space writ large. There's a constellation of actors is very is ever growing. I'm interested, I think, on these issues of coherence and incoherence that partnerships might address or might not, depending on how they are set up and function. And really, what is, you know, whether these hybrid forms of organization actually help to, and I'm thinking of climate change in particular, whether networks or multi-stakeholder partnerships actually help to, you know, Matt Hoffman talks about centripetal and centrifugal forces in climate governance. So whether these forms of organization and under what conditions can they allow for the expansion and contraction that global governance is not just a collection of actions, but a coherent and incremental collection of actions that that lead towards effective climate action. So I think for me it's a lot on the orchestration side, but that's a personal scholarly preference. I'm sure there are many different areas as well to explore.
And that seems like a really good note to end on, in fact. So we've run out of time, and so it's a good occasion to bring this final edition of IBEI's research seminar to a close. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Oscar, for bringing your perspectives to these issues, and thank you to the audience members that were able to join us. This is the last of the IBEI research seminars, but we still do have some events coming up that will be online, and you can find out about those on IBEI's webpage and follow IBEI on Twitter and Facebook and all of that kind of stuff. So I won't be there probably, but until then, until the next time, I hope everybody stays healthy and safe.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Oscar.
Hey, thanks, Teresa. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.
Bye, guys.